Cold Comfort Farm by Stella Gibbons, Chapter 21. Midsummer day dawned with a thick gray haze in the air and a heavy dew on the meadows and trees. Down among the little gardens of the still sleeping cottages of Howling, an idyllic procession might have been observed making its way from flower bed to flower bed, like ravaging bees. It was none other than the three members of Mrs. Beadle's embryo jazz band, shepherded by the patriarchal form of Agony Beadle himself. They had been commissioned to pick the bunches of flowers which were to decorate the church and the refreshment tables up at the farm. A lorry load of pink and white rose peonies from the Covent garden had already been discharged at the gates of the farm, and even now Mrs. Beadle and Flora were crossing and recrossing the yard with their arms full of sleeping flowers. Flora noted the heat haze with joy. It would be a day of heat, brilliant blue and radiant. Adam Lamb's breath had been even earlier astir, making wreaths of wallflowers from which to garland the horns of feckless, pointless, graceless, and aimless. It was not until he actually came to affix the decorations that he observed that none of the cows had any horns left and had been forced to fasten the wreaths round their necks and tails instead. This done, he led them forth to their morning pasture, singing a smutty wedding song he had learnt from for the marriage of George I. As the day emerged from the heat haze, the sky grew blue and sunny. The farm buzzed with energy like a hive. Phoebe, Letty, Jane, and Susan were whisking syllabubs in the dairy. Micah carried the pails of ice in the dairy, Micah carried the pails of ice in which stood the champagne down into the darkest and coolest corner of the cellar. Caraway and Harkaway were fixing the awning across from the gate of the yard to the door of the kitchen. Ezra was putting his rows of beans under a net to protect them from damage during the festivities. Mark and Luke were arranging the long trestle tables in the kitchen, while Mrs. Beadle and Flora unpacked the silver and linen sent down in crates from a London store. Reuben was filling with water the dozens of jars and vases in which the flowers were to be arranged. Mark Dolores Nancy was superintending the boiling of 24 eggs for everybody's breakfast, and upstairs in her bed lay Flora's new dress, a wonder of frilled and quilted, ruffled and tucked, pinked and shirred green batiste, and her plain hat of white straw. At 8:30, everybody sat down to breakfast in the dairy, for the kitchen was being prepared for the reception and could not be used for meals today. "I'll just take up our breakfast," said Mrs. Beadle. "Shall have to have it cold today. There's half an ham and a jar of pickled onions. I won't be a jiff." "Oh, I've just been to see Aunt Ada," said Flora, looking up from her breakfast. "She doesn't want anything for breakfast except a Hell's Angel. Here, give me an egg. I'll mix it for her. She rose and went over to the newly stocked store cupboard. Mrs. Beadle stared while Flora tossed an egg, 2 ounces of brandy, a teaspoon of cream, and some chips of ice in a jam jar, and everybody else was very interested too. "There," said Flora, giving Mrs. Beadle the foaming jam jar. "You run along upstairs with that." So Mrs. Beadle ran, but was heard to observe that it would take more than a mess like that to keep her stomach from rumbling before 1 o'clock. As for the other Starkadders, they were considerably intrigued by this dramatic change in Aunt Ada's diet. "Has the old un gone off again?" asked Reuben anxiously. "Will she come down and upset everything after all, do we think, Cousin Flora?" "Not on your sweet life," said Flora. "Everybody will be all right. Remember, I told you there was going to be a surprise. Well, it's just beginning." And the Starkadders were satisfied. Breakfast over, they all fell to work like demons, for the ceremony was at 12:30, and there was much to be done. Agony Beadle and the jazz band arrived with their arms full of nasturtiums, Sweet William, and cherry pie, and were sent off on a second journey for more. Reuben, obeying a request from Flora, pulled out from the cupboard, in which it was usually kept, the large carved chair in which Aunt Ada had sat on the night of the counting. Mark and Luke, who were so stupid they could have been relied upon to lay a mine under the house without who were so stupid that they could have been relied upon to lay a mine under the house without commenting upon it, were told to decorate it with wreaths of rose peonies. It was 10:30. The awning was up, looking immediately festive as awnings always do, and in the kitchen the 2 long trestle tables were decorated and ready. Flora had arranged 2 kinds of food for the 2 kinds of guests she was expecting. For the Starcatters and such of the local hoary peasantry as would attend, there were syllabubs, ice pudding, caviar sandwiches, crab patties, trifle, and champagne. For the country, or for the county, there was cider, home-cured ham, cheese, homemade bread, and salads made from local fruit. The table from which the county were fed was rich with cottage flowers. The rose efflorescence of the peonies floated above the table from which the peasantry would eat. Wreaths of cottage flowers, like chains of little gems, hung from the rafters. Their red, oranges, blues, and pinks glowed again against the soft, sooty black of the ceiling and walls. The air smelled sweet of cherry pie and fruit salad. Outside, the sun flamed in glory, and inside the kitchen there were these sweet smells and cool, delicious-looking food. Flora took a last look round and was utterly satisfied. It was 11 o'clock. She went upstairs to Aunt Ada's room, knocked at the door, and in response to a crisp, "Come in, my dear," entered and shut the door carefully behind her. Phoebe, who was on her way up to her room to put on her wedding array, nudged Susan. "Did you see that soul? There's something strange in the air today, lovey. And to think on it, our Rennet is no more a maid. Last night, as ever was, un came to say goodbye to me before un took the 12:30 train from Godmere with un's husband-to-be. Was un weeping, poor soul?" inquired Susan. "Nay, but un said un would feel safer when once the words was said, and un's man could not get away. Well, 'tis done now, Lord lovey, and they will be here for the breakfast, man and wife, as ever was." A hush now fell upon the cool, flower-garlanded, sweet-smelling farm. The sun climbed royally toward his zenith, and the shadows grew shorter. In a dozen bedrooms, the Starcatters struggled with their wedding garments. Flora came out of Aunt Ada's room exactly at 11:30 and went along to her own room. She was soon dressed. A bathe in cool water, 10 minutes brushing of her hair, and some business with her makeup boxes, and she emerged, serene, gay, and elegant, and ready for the pleasures of the day. She went straight down into the kitchen to reassure herself that everything was still as it should be, and arrived just in time to prevent Mr. Mybug, who had arrived unexpectedly early, from picking a cherry off one of the cakes. Rennet was imploring him not to. And he was laughing like a boyish fawn, or so he thought, and just about to pick at it when Flora sailed in. "Mr. Mybug!" exclaimed Flora. He jumped as though he had been stung and gave a boyish laugh. "Ha, ha, ha! Ah, dear lady, there you are." "Yes, and so are you, I see," said Flora. "There's plenty for everybody, Mr. Mybug. If you are hungry, Mrs. Beetle will cut you some bread and butter. How are you, Mrs. Mybug?" Flora pressed Rennet's hand graciously and congratulated her upon her striking toilet, which had been borrowed from one of Mr. Mybug's girlfriends, who drank rather a lot in one way and another, and kept a tame boxer in her studio for the sheer love of the thing. The other Starcatters now began to come downstairs, and at the sound of the church clock coming across the sunny fields, now warned them it was 12, and they thought it time to go down to the church. After a last glance round the flowery kitchen, Flora floated out with one hand on Reuben's arm, and the others followed. They found quite a big crowd already assembled outside the church, for the wedding had aroused much interest in neighboring villages, as well as in Howling itself. The little church was crammed, and the only empty seats were those for the county, and those in which the pantry from the farm now took their places, and those in which the party from the farm now took their places. On rising from her knees, Flora had leisure to study the decorations. They were really charming. Agony Beetle had done them, with the help of Mark Delar. They had agreed with pleasing unanimity that only white flowers were suitable to Elfine's extreme youth and undoubted purity. so the pews were hung with chains of marguerites, and 2 tall lilies stood like archangelic trumpets at the end of each pew, lining the aisle. There were many jars filled with white pinks, and altar steps where the bride would kneel were banked with snowy geraniums. Flora repressed the unworthy reflection that it reminded her of a white sale at Messrs. Marshall and Snellgrove's, and turned her attention to Letty, Jane, Phoebe, Prue, and Susan, who had all begun to cry. Silently, she fitted them all out with clean handkerchiefs from a store previously laid in for this very purpose. Reuben, very nervous, stood at the door waiting for Elfine. The sun blazed down outside. The organ wandered softly through a voluntary, and the crowd respectfully buzzed at the county as it came in, bustling with curiosity and wearing its direst hats. The hands of the clock tower jumped on, minute by minute, to the half hour. Flora took one cautious glance round the church before she settled down to wait in decorous quietude for the last few minutes. The church seemed full of Starkadders. They were all there, and all there by her agency, except the 4 whom she'd helped to escape. There they all were, enjoying themselves, having a nice time, and having it in an ordinary human manner, not having it because they were raping somebody or beating somebody or having religious mania or being doomed to silence by a gloomy earthy pride or loving the soil with a fierce desire of a lecher or anything of that sort. No, they were just enjoying an ordinary human event like any of the other millions of ordinary people in the world. Really, when she thought what they had all been like only 5 months ago, she bowed her head. She had accomplished a great work and had much to be thankful for, and today would see her achievements crowned. At last the organ struck bravely into Here Comes the Bride, and every hand turned toward the door, and every eye fixed itself upon the large car which had drawn up outside the church. A low murmur of interest went up, and now the crowd was cheering. Something tall, white, and cool as a cloud detached itself from the car and floated quickly along the path to the church door. Here comes the bride. Here is Elfine, pale and serious and starry-eyed as a bride should be, leaning upon the arm of Reuben. Here is Dick Hawk Monitor, his pleasant red face betraying none of the nervousness he must feel. Here is Mrs. Hawk Monitor, looking vague in gray, and the healthy Joan Hawk Monitor in pink organdy. A deplorable choice, quite deplorable, thought Flora regretfully. The procession reached the altar steps and halted. The music ceased. Into the hush that fell, the vicar's voice broke quickly yet gravely. Dearly beloved. It was not until she was standing in the vestry, smilingly watching the best man, Ralph Pent Harrington, kiss the bride, that Flora felt an unusual sensation in the palm of her right-hand glove. She looked down at it and saw, to her surprise and amusement, that it was split right across. She realized then that she had been extremely nervous lest anything should go wrong, but nothing had. And now she was extremely hungry. Susan, Letty, Phoebe, Prue, and Jane were still roaring away like town bulls, and Flora had to tell them rather sharply not to make such a noise. Several persons had already asked them in kindly concern if they were in pain or had had bad news. Of course, Mr. Mybug was explaining to Rennet, who was also crying because she had only a nasty registry office wedding and no lovely dress or wreath. Of course, this is all the sheerest barbarism. It's utterly pagan, and a bit obscene, too. If we only look below the ritual, that business of throwing the shoe, for instance. Mr. Mybug, we are all going up to the farm now. Of course you're coming too, Flora had interrupted him. She felt, just at the right moment. He hastily promised Rennet another wedding, a proper one, if she would only stop crying, and rushed away with her under his arm after the rest of the party. And that is the end of chapter 21.